Hello, everyone. Welcome back and thanks for joining me. I'm Sherry, and you are listening to From the Dark Side. Today, we've got a case out of New Jersey. A 34-year-old mom was found deceased in her car. From the surface, it looked like her car went down an embankment and it was nothing more than just a tragic accident. But a set of footprints leading away from the car was found in the snow, and police know that there is more to this story. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 143, The Case of Michelle Nyce. Let's go back to 2004 for this one. Harvard student Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook. President George Bush won re-election. Shrek 2 was the biggest film of the year, followed by Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban and Spider-Man 2. Martha Stewart went to prison for insider trading. Energy drinks became a fast-selling new item in grocery stores. The show Friends aired its last episode, and the show Lost premiered its first episode. I've never seen an entire episode of either of those. And in strange news from 2004, as you know, some thieves like to steal scrap metal. They can sell it, and the more metal you have, the more money you get. Well, some thieves in Serbia wanted some scrap metal, so they dismantled a 200-ton steel bridge. Locals woke up and were shocked to see that their bridge was missing. The thieves tried to make some quick cash, but mostly ruined everyone's commute to work. On the snowy morning of January 16, 2004, some utility workers in Hopewell, New Jersey were meeting up for breakfast. The area had been hit with a heavy snowstorm during the last few days, and there were lines down. They had a long day ahead of them, so they were going to grab breakfast before getting to work. On their way to the diner, they spotted an SUV that looked like it went down an embankment and partway into a creek. They grab a bite to eat, and on the way back, they see the SUV is still sitting there. So they go to investigate and call police after what they find inside. Police arrive and find a new Toyota Land Cruiser sitting there, and it's still running. They get to the car and see sitting in the driver's seat is the body of an adult female. She has a major gash on her head, which appeared to be from the accident, but police begin to notice some things looked off. For example, there's a suitcase in the car which contained a bunch of her clothes. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the passenger side of the vehicle that were not from the utility workers who stopped to investigate. There's blood on the outside of the vehicle. As well, the woman was barefoot and not dressed like she's going out during winter. She was 5 foot tall at 100 pounds, yet the driver's seat was positioned all the way back, like someone over 6 foot tall was driving instead. What the heck happened here? It all began in 1989. Dr. Jonathan Nyce was a researcher in the pharmaceutical industry. He was a 40-year-old doctor of philosophy and working on developing an asthma treatment. This is a pill that would cure asthma. Big stuff going on here. Pharmaceutical companies are paying a lot of money for his work. Jonathan suddenly found himself a multimillionaire. He didn't find himself. I should rephrase that better. His work paid off. He earned a lot of money over a few years due to his research. Jonathan is a workaholic. His days and nights are spent working on his research. All he had was his education and his work. That's it. He began to wonder what it would be like to have a wife and maybe some kids in the house. He's never really dated women because he never had the time to. All he does is work. Plus, he was socially awkward and didn't have many friends or know the first thing about dating. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, by the way. There's no rule book that says you have to date women and get married and have kids. But Jonathan was growing lonely. Jonathan is the complete opposite of a ladies' man and didn't know how to go about getting a girlfriend. A friend mentioned to him that there are these classified ads in the newspaper where you can become a pen pal with a woman overseas. It's a mail-order bride service, but it's advertised as a pen pal service. He thinks this is a great idea because it's not like going on an in-person date. He could get to know a woman before actually meeting and dating her. Jonathan begins conversing with a woman from the Philippines. Now, Jonathan is 40 years old. This woman is only 19. A beautiful young lady by the name of Michelle. They write letters back and forth and talked on the phone. Michelle lives in a poor area of the Philippines and has dreams of coming to America and marrying a rich man. Jonathan has dreams of marrying a beautiful young woman, so the two hit it off. Jonathan doesn't just bring her to America, though. Instead, he travels to the Philippines to spend a week with her. The picture that Jonathan had sent her of himself was taken when he was much younger, so she expected to see this young man, but instead he appeared much older than the photo he had sent her. She shrugs it off, though. They stay in a nice hotel. The catch was that her father would also be staying in this hotel with them. He wants to make sure this man isn't here to harm her. So they all three awkwardly stayed together. Jonathan won her dad over, though, and he gave them permission to marry each other. During the time Jonathan was visiting, she gets to go to all these fancy places she's never been able to afford, and this is in her own country. This is like a dream for her, getting to go places that she sees all the time, but she can't afford to go to. He buys her lots of gifts and even gives her family money. Jonathan asks Michelle to marry him. She emphatically says yes. There's a secret Jonathan is keeping from her, though. Jonathan is around 40 years old, but tells Michelle and her family that he is 30 years old. She thinks he's only 10 years older than her, when in reality, he's 20 years her senior. They get married, and initially she can't just move to the U.S. It was a process. She had to wait on her visa, which took months. Jonathan, meanwhile, traveled around the world but was sending money to Michelle while she awaited her visa to arrive. Once Michelle has her visa, they move into Jonathan's beautiful home in North Carolina. Michelle wastes no time furnishing it with all the very best high-end stuff. She was so happy to be a stay-at-home wife, and she loved every second of it. Jonathan begins taking her out to social gatherings, and she's able to meet his small circle of friends. She makes friends with the other wives and begins to feel at home here in America. Jonathan doesn't want people to know that Michelle met him through a classified ad, so he tells people he saw her on a beach and approached her. Michelle went along with this story because she didn't want her new friends to know that she was a mail-order bride. Jonathan isn't crazy about Michelle now having friends and going places. He basically wants her to stay in the house all day long and not interact with others. He wanted her to be totally dependent on him and not get to know anyone else. For example, Michelle wanted to get a gym membership. So what's he do? He has a full gym built inside their house. Now she doesn't have to leave and go to the gym. She could just go to their basement. He basically sees her as this meek little submissive housewife who has to stay at home all day and clean. Jonathan and Michelle welcomed 3 children. Michelle loved being a mom, and Jonathan wasn't much help since he was always buried in his work. But she could drive the kids to school, and that would get her out of the house for short periods of time. They decided to leave North Carolina and moved into a massive home in New Jersey where they could raise the 3 kids. Same rules applied. Michelle wasn't allowed to see the world. She only saw what Jonathan wanted her to see. He kept her sheltered from the outside. Going out for her was basically going to the grocery store or to attend things for the children, and that's it. Jonathan was extremely possessive and monitored her every whereabout. He was still doing good things, such as sending money to her home country to have a large playground built and paying for the education of some of her family members, but he just had this other side that was super controlling. Michelle spent a lot of money on things for the house. She and the kids had the best of everything, but Michelle wasn't happy. She was in her mid-20s and wanted to go out and see the world and make friends. She wanted to party at clubs and things she's never been able to do, but she just stays home and deals with it. In 2002, Jonathan and Michelle are going to have a bunch of work done to the yard, including trees being planted and beautiful flower beds. The house was on land that was a former horse farm, so there's 0 trees. This is Michelle's project since Jonathan is at work all the time. He gives her a budget of $50,000. To get started on this massive outdoor project, Michelle hires a landscaping company. One of the workers was a man by the name of Miguel. Miguel is younger, like Michelle. He has a longtime girlfriend that he lives with. They have kids and an apartment together, but they're not married. Michelle and Miguel were both from a different country, and they bonded over the fact that English wasn't their first language. They talk during his lunch breaks, and they develop a friendship. They begin talking about things other than the yard. They talk about their interests and things like that. They grew closer and eventually began having an affair. They were meeting up at shady hotels while Jonathan was at work. They talk and texted often. Michelle was super careful not to get caught, and so was Miguel. Remember, he's got a partner and kids at home too. Miguel's coworkers began to notice that Miguel was disappearing with the lady of the house often, but they didn't say a word to anyone, nor did they bring it up that Miguel has this family at home. They just went along with it. By early 2003, the drugs that Jonathan had developed were failing clinical trials, leaving his company in a bad spot. Investors are unwilling to sink more money into the venture, but they issued an ultimatum. The company could survive. They would put up the massive amount needed to save it, but only if Jonathan stepped down as the CEO. So he was terminated from the very company he had built from the ground up. This is a man who went from pharmaceutical companies throwing money at him for many years to doors closing in his face. Around the same time, another revelation came out. Michelle, his wife of over a decade, discovered the truth about his age. Jonathan was not 10 years older than her, as he had always claimed. He was 20 years older. I don't know how he thought he couldn't be caught. Apparently his mother had made a comment one day about Jonathan getting ready to turn 52, and Michelle's like, "What are you talking about?" His mother says, "Jonathan is turning 52. What?" Although deeply upset by his deception, Michelle just dealt with it. After all, they had been married for years and had 3 children together. At this point, she seemed to shrug it off. It's whatever to her, I guess. With Jonathan having to leave his company, he is now out of work and a stay-at-home dad. This drove Michelle crazy. With him being home all day, he was getting lazy. He was lounging all over the house all day. She couldn't have these outings with Miguel anymore since Jonathan is home all the time. Her already short leash he had her on was even shorter now. Jonathan decides he's going to use this time to write a children's book. Michelle would come in while he was working in his office and say, "This is my house," during the day, and start vacuuming around him, bumping into his chair with the vacuum. In her effort to have a little more freedom, she decided one way would be to get a job. So she took a job at Macy's department store working at the makeup and perfume counter. Having this job helped her to feel more independent and help bring more money into the house. She also decided that she wanted to go to school in the evenings to get a certificate to become a personal trainer. Michelle is gone now in the evenings taking these classes, but one night the phone rings and it's the school's administrator leaving a message that the classes would start the following week. Jonathan is confused because he thinks his wife has been going to these classes in the evening for weeks, but they haven't even started yet. Jonathan says that he received another call one day. The caller claimed that he had knowledge that Michelle had been cheating on him. Jonathan asks, "What kind of proof do you have?" The caller begins playing a recording, and he can hear Michelle's voice, and he hears 2 people having sex. It was obviously Michelle in these recordings, plus the other person in the recording was yelling Michelle's name. The caller tells Jonathan he has to pay up $500,000 or else he was going to release this recording to his friends and business associates. He said, "If you think these audio clips are bad, I also have videotapes." According to reporting by Dennis Murphy for NBC News, Jonathan contacts the Hopewell Police Department. A detective was assigned to the case since this is now an extortion attempt. This detective sits down with both Jonathan and Michelle comes clean about her affair and says it was with Miguel the landscaper. But Michelle said that she had recently broken up with him after he began stalking her and demanding money from her. He was asking intrusive questions like, how much money do you have in the bank? How much is your house worth? He allegedly asked her for $3,000 and she declined to give it to him, but ended up giving him $1,000 instead. This detective meets with Miguel and he denies making this phone call to Jonathan. A restraining order was issued, so he wasn't allowed anywhere near Michelle going forward. The police weren't able to find any connection or evidence that Miguel made this phone call, so they drop it. In fact, it's believed that Jonathan found the phone numbers of calls being placed to and from the house and discovered it was the landscaper she was having an affair with, so he made up this story about receiving a call demanding money. And Jonathan wants to tack on this restraining order against Miguel so they have something come out of it. The order is good for 2 years. Miguel is to have no contact with Michelle, Jonathan, or even come near them. But just a few weeks later, Michelle met up with Miguel and the affair continued. Jonathan had since put Michelle on a budget of $300 a month, and he stopped sending money to her family back in the Philippines. Jonathan tried to make Michelle happy during this time. He started dressing more modern and going to clubs with her and being more carefree and less socially awkward, but Michelle realized her and her husband were nothing alike. Their ideas of a good time are completely different. Michelle wants to party and Jonathan wants to sit at home and play Scrabble. Michelle also wanted someone who was closer to her age, like Miguel. Michelle is really unhappy now and trying to figure out a way to leave. 6 months later, January 16th, 2004, Michelle would be located in her vehicle deceased at the bottom of a ravine. When the police arrived, the car is still running. They saw a set of footprints in the snow leading away from the passenger seat. There's blood frozen to the outside of the vehicle, including on the running board. Things aren't adding up because Michelle wasn't wearing any shoes. She's got suitcases full of her clothes in the back. An ice scraper was found near the gas pedal, like someone was using it to control the gas pedal. Michelle is around 5 foot tall and 100 pounds. The driver's seat is positioned all the way back. She has a large gash on her forehead. Police believe this was no accident and someone killed her, but now they have to prove it. They need undeniable proof their theory is correct, or else it won't hold up in court. They also need enough evidence to prove someone tampered with the body. Police run the vehicle tags and see it's registered to a Mr. Jonathan Nyce that lives a mile away. They head over there and knock on the door. 2 children come to the door and say their dad isn't home. They say their dad had to take their brother to school but would be right back. When Jonathan arrives, he pulls in and closes the garage door. This doesn't seem odd to me at all, but to the detectives it did. They tell him about his wife's accident. He asks which hospital she's recovering in, and they explain that she wasn't alive when she was found. Jonathan said that Michelle was supposed to work last night at Macy's from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., and then she was going to meet up with a friend. He says she told him that she would be home around 1 a.m. Police know the history of this couple from months ago when they showed up at the police station about the alleged extortion attempt, so they ask if she had perhaps another secret affair she was meeting up for. He says Michelle was having an affair, but it ended months ago because the guy was trying to extort money from him. You know this, and you guys were the ones who issued the restraining order. He says it has to be Miguel who did this. He said once Miguel called him and said he was gonna, quote, kill that bitch. He tells the officers that Miguel and his wife definitely have to be involved in this accident. The prosecutor's office sends a detective to the house, and he noticed Jonathan wasn't wearing any shoes or socks. He also appeared disheveled. Jonathan has read his Miranda rights, but told that he is not officially a suspect at this time. An autopsy is performed later that evening. Michelle had 3 deep lacerations on her forehead, extensive skull fractures, internal and external injuries, including cuts and bruises in her hands, indicating defensive wounds. Her official cause of death was blunt force trauma, and he determined that she had been alive for 10 minutes after the fatal injury. The next morning, a search warrant was issued for the Nyce's home, but they didn't have enough officers to start the search until later that evening since their house was so enormous. Jonathan is questioned at the police station for hours. He says he last spoke to Michelle around 4 p.m., right before she headed to Macy's for her evening shift. He says he took the kids out for a movie and then returned home and put them to bed. Jonathan later says that he thought things were going well with him and Michelle, but she was planning on moving out of the house. They ask, "When did you have this conversation with her?" And he replied, "Last night." Well, this contradicts his story that the last time he saw her was at 4 p.m. before she went to work. Meanwhile, a search is taking place at their home. They found a baseball bat with Michelle's blood on it. It looked clean until they swabbed it and traces of blood were found. There were large blood stains in the garage that someone tried to clean up. There were specks of blood splatter on the wall. In the washing machine, they found reddish pink water and Jonathan's clothes were soaking in it. They found bloody towels shoved into the chimney. Their theory is that she was dead before she ever got in the car. Her body was placed in the driver's seat. Jonathan allegedly was in the passenger seat. He uses the ice scraper to control the pedals. The car leaves their garage and drives through their gated community. He steers the car off the road and down the embankment and into the creek. Then he gets out, leaving footprints in the snow leading away from the car. He goes home and waits for someone to call about the wrecked vehicle. But the most damning piece of evidence they found was a pair of men's loafers. The soles of the loafers had been removed, but they found glue was stuck to the bottom, almost like someone took a pair of loafers and glued a separate sole to them, but the soles are missing. This is a huge 5,000 square foot house, and now they have to locate these soles. They found pieces of the soles cut up and hidden around the house. In the kids' toy box, in a box of Christmas decorations, they were really hidden deep in some spots. Like a jigsaw puzzle, they pieced all of the pieces of the soles together, and now they have a boot print. The boot print was a match to the set of prints in the snow leading away from Michelle's car. This is the smoking gun. Police also learned that the couple was broke. They were about to put their house up for sale. They had very little money coming in. That was one reason why Michelle took a job at Macy's. Jonathan asked the police, "Was my wife with Miguel last night?" He says he needs to know. They responded, "Yes, she was." At this point, Jonathan becomes inconsolable. Police learned that once Michelle got off work, she met up with Miguel at a shady hotel where the two had sex. Miguel says that after he slept with Michelle, she left and he met some friends at a bar. The bartender would confirm that Miguel was there ordering drinks at the time Michelle was killed. They remembered him and have receipts and surveillance, so Miguel is ruled out. Around midnight, Michelle returned home and a fight happened in the garage. Michelle packed her suitcases and loaded them into her car. The evidence showed Jonathan grabbed a baseball bat and beat her with it. Then he smashed her forehead into the garage floor a few times. Once she was dead, he loaded her into the driver's seat of her car. He then maneuvered the car from the passenger seat and set it down a ravine. The car was a secondary crime scene. The actual murder took place in the garage. He walked up the ravine away from the crash and the 1 mile back home and cut up his shoe soles, and he cleaned up evidence. Jonathan is placed under arrest and charged with his wife's murder. Jonathan later admitted that he killed Michelle, but it wasn't the way they claim it happened. He says that when Michelle got home that night, he confronted her in the garage and she attacked him with a stiletto high-heel shoe. He says during this attack, she fell and hit her head. But none of the evidence could back this up. Michelle had injuries consistent with a baseball bat to the head. Jonathan's defense team claims that this was self-defense. The prosecution says, nah, this is murder. They also say that Miguel never attempted to extort any money from the family. It was just a lie Jonathan made up to humiliate Michelle and a way to get a restraining order against Miguel. He also used it as an excuse for how he found out about the affair. He didn't want to say, "I was going through your phone records," so he makes up this story about receiving an extortion call. Jonathan's lawyer says his client was innocent. He said that if Jonathan wanted to kill Michelle, he could have designed a drug to do it. The man was a pharmaceutical genius. They claim there's no way he would have murdered her in a violent manner the way that he did. The trial went on for 5 weeks, and it took the jury 3 days to come up with a verdict. Jonathan was found not guilty of Michelle's murder. Instead, he was found guilty of passion-provoked manslaughter. During the sentencing phase, the judge said he had taken Jonathan's character and history into account in his sentencing by saying, quote, "Much of what Jonathan Nyce did in his life was good." You all know exactly what that means when a judge says that. Jonathan was only sentenced to 8 years in prison. Since he had good behavior in prison, he was released in 5 years. Jonathan moved in with his parents and wrote a book for anyone who wants to read it, saying he was innocent and he changed his story about the way Michelle died. The book was titled Under Color of Law: The Deliberate Conviction of an Innocent Man and the Destruction of a Family. According to Forensic Files Now, Jonathan claims that Miguel got Michelle into bed by drugging her and then he took to stalking her. Jonathan blamed Michelle's death on Miguel, saying she died clutching Miguel's black hair in her hands and her fatal injuries probably came from falling off the motel balcony. He also says that the only reason Michelle went to the motel late that night was because she was tricked and thought she was going to a baby shower instead. It's not completely over for Jonathan because in 2024, Jonathan was found to be carrying out a long-term scheme involving pharmaceutical drugs. So pet owners who had terminally ill dogs with cancer were giving their dogs this pill designed by Jonathan that would supposedly cure canine cancer, but it really didn't do anything except cost a lot of money. This went on for years, from 2012 till 2020. According to reporting by DVM 360, Jonathan created multiple companies called Canine Care and a few others. They advertised they had developed a medication that would cure cancer in dogs. The investigation found that the drugs Jonathan was marketing were a collection of bulk ingredients coming from various sources that he blended himself at a facility. It's reported that he told prospective customers that he could get their pets into clinical trials, but they would need to give him large amounts of money to secure their spot. He ended up selling $1 million worth of useless medication to pet owners. In total, he had 900 victims. Attorney Jacqueline Romero said, quote, "In shopping these worthless drugs to desperate pet owners, Jonathan Nyce's actions were both criminal and cruel. He deliberately exploited people's emotions, their love for their ailing dogs, purely for his own financial gain. Many people consider dogs members of their families, so they're especially vulnerable to such schemes. For defrauding his victims and thumbing his nose at the FDA, justice demanded that Mr. Nyce be held accountable." At his trial, he tried to convince everyone that his products were legit, almost like if he used big keywords like 20 years of cancer research and tumor suppression mechanism and breakthrough, that the judge would believe him. The prosecutor in this case said, "It's clear to me that if he thinks that if he just keeps talking, he can eventually convince everyone that he's right. He talked and he talked and he talked and he lied and he lied and he lied. And he stole nearly $1 million from hundreds of people desperate to save their dying pets." In February 2024, Jonathan was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison. That's the same sentence he received for killing Michelle. Once he is released, he will be on probation for 3 years. It seems like Jonathan did a lot of good in his lifetime until he hit his upper 40s and became a murderer and one that takes advantage of pet owners with terminally ill dogs. Once released from prison, Jonathan will be in his early 80s. I don't know whatever happened to Michelle's kids. They're all adults now, but they were small children at the time of their mom's death. I don't know if they went to live with Jonathan's family or Michelle's family in the Philippines. I'm not sure. According to her obituary, Michelle is remembered as a member of the Filipino American Association of Central New Jersey. She was very involved in her children's lives, serving as their room mother and participating in the children's sports activities. She was 34 years old at the time of her death and would be 55 years old today. Rest in peace to Michelle Nyce. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.